Hello, and welcome to Talking About English, the podcast where we make learning English fun, practical, and easy to understand. I'm Julia, your host, and I'm so excited to have you here with me today. In this episode, we're exploring the present perfect tense, one of the most interesting and widely used tenses in English. It's the key to talking about experiences, actions that continue into the present, and so much more. Whether you're a language learner, an English teacher, or just curious about grammar, you're in the right place. And I'm not doing this alone today. I have a special guest joining me. Please welcome Rick, an experienced English teacher and language expert. Rick, thank you so much for being here today. Before we dive into the details, Rick, I'd love to start with a general question. Why do you think the present perfect tense is so important for English learners to master?
Hi there. Thanks so much for having me, Julia. It's great to be here on Talking About English. The present perfect tense is such a fascinating topic, and I'm excited to dive into it with you. It's one of those tenses that can be tricky at first, but once learners get the hang of it, it really opens up new ways to express ideas and connect thoughts in English. The present perfect tense. It's like a linguistic time machine, allowing us to connect different points in time seamlessly. But what if I told you that this grammatical structure doesn't even exist in many languages?
Oh, that's a fascinating perspective. I never thought about it that way. So, how exactly does this time machine work in English?
Well, the present perfect tense is used for past actions that are related to or continue into the present. It's like building a bridge between two time periods in a single grammatical structure. We form it using the auxiliary verbs have or has, followed by the past participle of the main verb.
I see. So, could you give us an example of how this works in practice?
Certainly. Let's say, I have gone fishing since I was a child. This sentence connects a past action, starting to fish as a child, with the present, still going fishing now. It's not just about what happened in the past, but how it relates to the present moment.
That makes sense. Are there any specific rules about when to use have versus has?
Good question. We use have for most subjects, but has for third-person singular subjects like he, she, or it. So you might say he has just left, or they have grown so much.
I see. You know, I've always found it tricky to know when to use the present perfect versus the simple past. Any tips on that?
That's a common stumbling block. The key is to think about the speaker's intention. Are they emphasizing the result of an action, the duration, the connection to the present? Understanding these nuances can guide you towards the correct usage. For instance, both I lost my keys and I have lost my keys are correct, but they imply different things. The past simple suggests that the action is completely in the past, while the present perfect implies that the loss is still relevant to the present moment, perhaps because you're still looking for the keys.
Oh, that's a helpful distinction. So, what are some common uses of the present perfect tense?
Well, there are several key uses. First, we use it for ongoing actions that started in the past, but haven't been completed yet. For example, the professor has taught here for 2 decades implies that they're still teaching there now. Second, we use it for actions that have been completed multiple times in the past and are likely to happen again in the future. If you say, I've seen that movie 6 times, it implies that you might watch it again.
Interesting. Are there any other common uses we should be aware of?
Absolutely. We also use it for actions that were completed very recently, often with words like just or now. For instance, I've just brushed my teeth, or we've finished practice now. It's also great for describing changes over time, like, my cousin has grown so much since I saw her 2 years ago. Lastly, we use it to add significance to a completed action, often for great achievements or dramatic events. If someone says, I've met the love of my life, they're emphasizing the importance of the event and its connection to the present.
Rick, sometimes learners ask about strange or unusual ways people might use the present perfect tense. Do you have an example of a, let's say, less than smart way to use it?
Absolutely, Julia. Here's a silly one. I have eaten 27 pizzas this week, and I'm currently considering my 28th. Technically, it's correct. since it's talking about an action that's happened repeatedly over a period of time up to now. But I think we'd all agree it's a bit extreme. Not to mention probably a bad life choice.
That's hilarious, Rick. And definitely not recommended. For grammar or health reasons. Let's talk about some more practical ways to use the present perfect. That's quite a range of uses. I'm curious, how do non-native English speakers cope with this tense, especially if their native language doesn't have an equivalent?
That's an excellent question. From what I understand, it can be quite challenging for speakers of languages that don't have a similar tense. For example, in many Asian languages, the concept of a perfect tense doesn't exist in the same way. Learners from these language backgrounds often have to rewire their thinking about how to express the relationship between past and present.
I can imagine that would be quite a mental hurdle to overcome. Do you have any tips for learners who are struggling with the present perfect tense?
Well, one of the best ways to get comfortable with the present perfect is through extensive exposure and practice. Reading English books, watching movies and TV shows, and engaging in conversations with native speakers can help internalize the usage patterns. It's also helpful to create personal examples. For instance, a learner could think about their own life experiences and try to describe them using the present perfect tense.
Those are great suggestions. I think another helpful approach might be to practice with some specific scenarios. Could you give us an example of how we might do that?
Yes, let's try this. Imagine you're describing your experience with learning English. How would you express that using the present perfect tense? Think about it for a moment.
I see what you're getting at. So we might say something like, I have been studying English for 5 years, right?
Exactly. That's a perfect example. It shows an action that started in the past and continues into the present. Now let's try another one. How would you use the present perfect to describe a recent achievement? Take a moment to think about it.
Well, we could say something like, I have just completed my first marathon, couldn't we?
That's spot on. You're really getting the hang of this. Now let's talk about some common mistakes people make with the present perfect tense. One of the most frequent errors is using it with specific time expressions. For example, saying, I have gone to the store yesterday, instead of I went to the store yesterday.
Oh, I can see how that would be confusing. Are there any other common pitfalls we should be aware of?
Yes, another tricky area is the difference between gone and been in sentences like, I have been to the store versus I have gone to the store. When we say I have gone to the store, it implies that the person is still at the store or on their way there. On the other hand, I have been to the store means that the person went to the store and has now returned.
Wow, that's a subtle but important distinction. As we're discussing all these nuances, I'm struck by how complex yet intuitive the present perfect tense can be once you really understand it.
You're absolutely right. It's one of those aspects of English that really allows for nuanced expression. Once you master it, you can convey so much about the relationship between past actions and the present moment. It's like, coming back to our opening metaphor, a linguistic time machine, allowing us to connect different points in time seamlessly.
That's such a great way to put it. Do you have any final thoughts or advice for our listeners who might be grappling with the present perfect tense?
I think the key is to remember that mastering the present perfect tense, like any aspect of language learning, takes time and practice. Don't get discouraged if it doesn't click immediately. Keep exposing yourself to the language, practice using the tense in your own speech and writing, and pay attention to how native speakers use it. Over time, it will become more intuitive.
That's excellent advice. And I suppose we should remember that even native speakers sometimes struggle with the finer points of grammar, right?
Yeah, the goal is effective communication, not perfection. Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about when it comes to the present perfect tense. We've covered its formation, its various uses, some common pitfalls, and even touched on learning strategies.
We certainly have. And who knows? Maybe some of our listeners have just had their aha moment with the present perfect tense.
That would be wonderful. Remember, language learning is a journey, not a destination. Keep practicing, keep exploring, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how we learn and grow.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Until next time, keep practicing those tenses, and remember, every conversation is an opportunity to learn something new about language.